we have a sense that we have defined terms when it comes to biblical inerrancy and biblical the biblical scriptures, that in some ways, why would God, for example, allow there to be differences, textural differences? I mean, just the nature of the report. Why would he allow these differences that seem confusing? And by the way, you don't think these were available and obvious to people in the first century who were assembling the canon? You don't think that Irenaeus, you don't think that Ignatius could look at those gospels and say, these seem to be slightly different? Well, clearly they knew enough in the earliest ages of this to not flinch under the differences, because they had access to the people who actually wrote the accounts. And so they could actually do some interviewing of themselves. We don't have that access now. So my thinking on this is that if God wanted to give us 4 accounts that actually met the criteria and standard of any other eyewitness account you might learn of in your own experience as a detective, these 4 accounts have the exact level of variation I would expect to see from 4 eyewitnesses. But again, the idea that I can throw out a number of these contradictions, which have been asked and answered for thousands of years, it really, to me, is a bit of a sneaky play, if you think about it.
You say, I've heard you say this before, that whenever you were at a crime scene and you knew there were eyewitnesses around, you would ensure that the eyewitnesses were separated. In other words, you wouldn't put them all in the back of, say, the same police cruiser, because if they started talking to one another, they may iron out their stories. Why? Unpack that further. Why would you separate them? You wanted variation, in other words, didn't you?
Well, yeah, let's put it this way. If we had one gospel, there'd be no variations.
Right.
Yeah. One gospel, no variations.
Yeah.
And so, but with 2, now we're tempted. Should we harmonize these?
Yeah.
There were people in history who tried to harmonize the Gospels.
Yeah.
And they did that because they saw the same thing that we're seeing thousands of years ago. They saw the same thing we're seeing. I don't want the harmonization, because the harmonization always comes with information loss. You're going to have, I want the subtle differences that are almost confusing, head-scratching differences. I want those because there's some truth that's embedded in there that will account for the differences in the observations or the differences in the descriptions of the observations. It's either going to tell me something about a more robust nature of the event itself or something about the report giver. Like, why would he say it this way? That's going to tell me something about the author, because he might be pinning on something different or have his own set of commitments coming into it. And God allows the biblical authors to retain their unique personal dispositions as they're writing the account. And that's why you get these accounts. Now, it's almost like the sense that if this is God ordained, they should be word for word identical. Well, if that was the case, why would you need 4 gospels? You wouldn't. You just need 1. The reason why we have 4 gospels is because the picture is so much more robust. And we're going to learn about that picture. That's why I tell the dispatchers, separate the eyewitnesses. Don't let them harmonize their statement before I get there. Our job as the detective who's reading the reports decades later is to think about the inferences and the harmonization. Like what's the bigger, robust picture? I do not want someone else doing that work before I get there. Give it to me in its messiest form, because that's how humans are.
How often has it happened in your experience where a judge or an attorney is able to identify that 2 eyewitnesses were in collusion to make up a story, and they almost say the same thing word for word, and either the defense attorney or the judge says, you guys are in collusion here? Does that ever happen?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it happens usually long before filing. So in other words, one of the ways we catch people who are making these kinds of claims is that they are colluding. They're making a false claim, and we can catch it before we even get to a filing point. But yeah, that often it's so great because, what we're talking about are things that, if you think about it, you innately know are true. If you've raised kids, you know when they're lying to you because their stories are so aligned, right? And so when you have a jury and they even hear this close alignment of testimony, you can tell they're innately suspicious before you have to bring it up in the closing argument. Like, they already get it. They already don't trust these 2 guys because of how close their stories are. So this is what's so great about just having an intuitive sense. Here's what I would say to Bart. And not to Bart, just to anybody who's struggling with this kind of thinking on it. If all we had were 4 accounts of an ancient man called Jesus. And by the way, Bart does not just deny Jesus' existence. Bart believes there is a Jesus of Nazareth.
Who was crucified.
Yeah. So I would say that if you were to take out all of but he's not born of a virgin anymore. Take out all of his miracles. He never fed 5,000, never walked on water. He didn't rise from the grave. He didn't ascend into heaven. Just a dude who was smart, preached some amazing sermons, lived an amazing ministry life, and then eventually died of just whatever. He can't even be crucified, let's say, but he dies crucified. Okay, no scholar on either side of the aisle would doubt the historicity of Jesus, even with all of these variations, which are easily reconcilable, but that they will point to as irreconcilable contradictions. Nobody would doubt the historicity of Jesus. He is the most and best attested ancient until you add one miracle. Now you add a supernatural element to this story, and now everyone's like, yeah, this can't be true. And it's not based on the manuscript evidence or the number of manuscripts we have or our ability to return to the original intent of those manuscripts because of all the copies we have. It's not based on all that. It's all based on a presuppositional bias against the supernatural. Because without the supernatural, no one's going to flinch. And if what Bart is doing is he's just saying, hey, I'm going to strip out the supernatural, and now that's the version of Jesus I believe. The version that has no supernatural in it. Well, okay, so now what's this whole argument about? By the way, the version of this, you believe that version of Jesus, even with all the contradictions you allegedly say are in the New Testament, but you just strip out the supernatural. So there's a version of Jesus you believe in, but it's the one that doesn't ask you to bend your knee. It's the one who's not God.
Yeah.
It's the one who doesn't claim authority as God. It's the one that says you believe in the version of Jesus that just becomes a character in history, not one that says, Bart, your identity is not in you. Your identity is in me. That version is offensive to a lot of people.
Right.
And it's not so much about the historical claims.
Well,
it's really more about like, where do we form our identity? What makes us valuable?
True. And when Bart's been asked, his real problem with Christianity is not alleged contradictions in the New Testament documents. His problem is he thinks the Bible is an inadequate explanation for the problem of evil.
Right.
So,
and he wrote a book about this.
Yeah,
but let me put it this way.
Yeah.
It's another kind of tell on this. And he writes this in the introduction to Jesus Interrupted, where he talks about his relationship with Bruce Metzger.
Yes.
And remember, these two guys are two detectives who are standing at the edge of a crime scene. And they're both standing with their detective suits, kind of like our friend Greg Kokel talks about Columbo in his jacket, right? And he's got his trench coat on. And so these two detectives are sitting there both, and they've got their cigars, and they're like looking at each other, and they're looking across the yellow tape, and they're looking at the same exact evidence in the crime scene, the exact same evidence. There's not a single piece of evidence in that crime scene that Bart is looking at that Bruce didn't look at first. Not only that, Bruce has got better pedigree, went to a better detective school. All three of his schools were better pedigree. As a matter of fact, Bruce is the dude, the FTO, the field training officer, who trained up Bart to even get this job as a detective to begin with.
Before we go any further, just so our listeners know, Jim here is talking about Bruce Metzger, who was probably the top manuscript scholar in the world of the 20th century. He taught at Princeton University. He actually had Bart Ehrman as a student, and together they updated Metzger's classic academic work called The Text of the New Testament the same year he put out Misquoting Jesus. But anyway, okay, so you're so
here they are, these two detectives.
One Bruce is and Bart together. Okay,
yes, they're two detectives looking across that yellow tape, looking at that evidence. Everything that the young detective Bart Ehrman is looking at, the old guy is going, yeah, it's been there, done that. Already saw that. I'm surprised it took you this long to notice it, but I've already seen that stuff. As a matter of fact, this is his training officer. This is the younger guy is basically the trainee of the older guy, and the older guy has got his pedigree, both his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD from Princeton, and the younger guy has got his bachelor's from Moody, which is great. I mean, it's fine, but it's not Princeton, you know, in terms of the secular world for sure. Got his master's at Wheaton, which is okay, but it's not, no. And then he finally gets his PhD when he goes under the wing of Bruce Metzger. Here's my point. They're both these two detectives smoking the same cigars, looking across the line, and one is going, yeah, completely different. Look, Bruce died as a believing Christian, knowing all the stuff that Bart knew, and knowing it longer. and being the trainer of Bart. It's not about what's on the other side of the yellow tape. I guess Bart is the only one who knew about these differences in the Gospels. No, Bruce knew about all those differences too. There's not a single piece of evidence that Bruce wasn't aware of. And he talks about this in his interview with Lee Strobel. And so this, in the end though, he's unflinching. And not because he has a prior commitment to it. He's looking at the same evidence. So it's not about the evidence. It's never been about the evidence. This is true for jurors. I know that there are some jurors I could impanel that will never convict, and even on an overwhelming case. Why? Because they enter the box with prior commitments, prior emotional commitments, prior lifestyle commitments, prior presuppositional commitments. And we have a voir dire process so we can interview the jurors to discover their prior commitments. And both sides do this, the prosecution and the defense, because they don't want people coming in who are so committed to their prior commitments that they won't change their mind. And this is what happens, right? And so it turns out that what determines your verdict often in these kinds of cases is your prior commitments, not the evidence. It's not about the evidence. If it was, either Bruce would agree with Bart or Bart would agree with Bruce.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Let's suppose that it's Metzger that has the prior commitments. He wants to believe in God, and Bart is being a little bit more honest. How does the evidence favor Bruce, even though he may have a prior commitment?
Well, okay, first of all, you got to ask yourself, what is the prior commitment here? I suspect largely what it is either a prior commitment to either open-handed supernaturalism, I believe in such things, or nope, I don't believe in anything supernatural, nothing that can't be explained with space-time, matter, chemistry, and physics. Or it may simply be a problem of a moral commitment.
Right.
Some moral commitment that says either I don't like what God's rules are, or I think that something about God is offensive, or I think something about God's judgment of me is offensive, whatever that may be. So it's going to be one of those two kinds of commitments, right? I think the question is, regardless of, yes, do both have commitments? Absolutely. There's something about Bruce, but here's my point. It's not about the evidence. It's all about the commitments. And I would say if you're somebody who's been raised in the church, you may have a set of prior commitments that also prevents you. But as a matter of fact, how many people do we meet doing this work that have never even looked at the evidence for Christianity? They don't even care about it. That's not necessary to them. They've already got a prior commitment. They're in. You couldn't even talk me out of it. I'm in. Okay. I'm just committed to it. I love this life. Love me some Jesus. Love the kind of life it's created for me. I'm not moving. That could be as equally anti-intellectual approach as being committed against it. So my question is, are your commitments realistic? Are your commitments sound? So if your commitment is that you think that there's evil, and this would just exclude God, maybe you haven't quite thought clearly about how you could call something evil to begin with, number one. So it's about your commitments. Or if you think I'm committed natural, which was my thing. My thing was that I was a committed naturalist. I would have far been more likely to side with Bart. Because to me, the idea that any true explanation could include something outside of space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry was just stupid. I mean, there's no reason to go there. And now I'm not doing history anymore. I'm doing mythology. Now I'm not doing science anymore. I'm doing pseudoscience. This is what I would have said. So for me, it was about examining your commitments. Here's what I would say. If you think that the commitments, I do think commitments are what's keeping us, then just be the kind of person who examines your prior commitments. If you've got a good reason to reject I don't think I do. I realized at some point, no, I already believed there was something outside of space, time, and matter that was governing the universe because it was the creator of this universe. I think Big Bang cosmology is still the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. And if that's the case, I'm already stuck with something outside of space, time, and matter. So I just knew that my commitments weren't sound. And if I strip away the commitments, how strong is the evidence? It's really strong. Now, here's what I would say. Everyone talks about how, yes, eyewitness testimony can be some of the weakest forms of testimony because not only are eyewitnesses fallible, eyewitnesses lie. So I would say the same thing. I'd never trust an eyewitness. You shouldn't trust an eyewitness either. If it's a case from 30 years ago or anything in Scripture, what we do is we test eyewitnesses. And the jury instructions are very clear on this. Not only are they clear on how to test an eyewitness, they're clear on what to do with that guy, even though you don't like what he's saying. You don't like how he looks. You don't like his attitude. But if he passed the test, you're stuck with this guy. You're instructed that you cannot reject his testimony because he looks like your lying uncle, or he's the wrong race, or you don't like his attitude. Or no, you have to figure out where in these categories that are very specific does he fail. And if he fails, they're great. You can distrust him. But you can't just say, I distrust him because I don't like the guy. That is not the criteria that we're using. So that, for me, was open the door to be able to test these eyewitnesses. But let me just say this. The fact that the eyewitnesses differ is a selling point. It's not a detracting point. It was the very thing that got me interested. When I read through the Gospels for the very first time and I saw everything that Bart's talking about, I was encouraged. That's when I decided to test them, because I'll tell you what, I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting this typical boilerplate junk you get from liars. Instead, what I had were these subtle variations that were like, wow, that's the kind of thing a defense attorney is definitely going to twist.